My name is Elliot, and I was 14 years old this summer. Everything I thought I knew about myself came apart at the seams, and then, strangely, gently, was stitched back together into something I never expected to become. I want to tell you this story the way I remember it because for years I kept it locked inside a small wooden box in the back of my closet, the same closet where the whole thing really began, and I think if I do not tell it now, in my own voice, at my own pace, then someone else will one day tell it wrong, and this story deserves to be told right, from beginning to end, without cuts, without edits, without pretending the softer parts did not happen. So sit with me, if you will, and let me take you back to a small town in late June, to a house with a creaking wooden staircase and lilac wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, to a boy who did not yet know who he was, and to the two people who, in their own imperfect ways, showed him. It started with a pair of stockings. That is the honest truth. Not something dramatic, not something forbidden, just a pair of pale, silvery stockings that my mother had folded neatly and left on top of the laundry basket at the end of the hallway. I was 14, awkward in the way that only 14-year-old boys can be, all elbows and knees, hair that would not sit right, a voice that cracked when I got excited about anything, and I was walking past that basket on my way to my bedroom when I saw them, and I stopped. I do not know why I stopped. I have asked myself 100 times over the years, and the closest answer I can give is that they looked like something from another world, something impossibly delicate, something that did not belong in our practical, tidy, ordinary house, and I wanted, for just a moment, to touch that other world. I picked them up. They were softer than I expected. Cooler, too, almost like water running through my fingers, and I remember standing there in the hallway with the afternoon sun coming through the little round window at the end of the corridor, holding these stockings and feeling my heart begin to beat in a way I did not understand. It was not fear, exactly. It was not shame, not yet. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a lake in the early morning, knowing the water is going to be cold, knowing you are going to step in anyway. I took them to my room. I closed the door. And I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at them for a very long time. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself I was going to look and then fold them and put them back where they belonged and never think about them again. But my hands, which seemed to have a mind of their own that afternoon, were already sliding one of them up my leg, and the sensation was so strange, so smooth, so unlike anything I had ever felt, that I actually laughed out loud, a small, breathless laugh, because it was ridiculous and wonderful and utterly forbidden all at once. When I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror on the back of my bedroom door, I saw a scrawny boy in a t-shirt and boxer shorts with two pale, shimmering legs, and I did not recognize those legs, and yet they were mine, and I felt something shift inside my chest, a little door that I had not known was there swinging open just a crack. I sat back down. I took the stockings off, carefully, so carefully, and I folded them and placed them under my pillow. I told myself I would put them back in the morning. I did not put them back in the morning. That summer had a rhythm to it. My mother, whose name was Diane, worked mornings at the small local library, and she would leave the house at 8 and come home at 1, and the middle of the day belonged to me. My father had passed away when I was 9, of an illness that came fast and left faster, and so it had been just the two of us for 5 years, and Diane had learned to give me space and I had learned to give her quiet, and we made a kind of small, careful world together, the two of us in that little house on Maple Row. My best friend, Julian, lived 3 doors down. He had been my best friend since we were 7, when he had moved in with his aunt after his own parents split, and the two of us had bonded over comic books and creek exploration, and the shared understanding that our families were a little bit broken in ways we did not talk about. Julian was taller than me by then, broader in the shoulders, with dark curly hair that he was always pushing out of his eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. He was the confident one, the one who talked to girls at school without turning red, the one who could walk into any situation and make it his. I was the quiet one, the one who listened, the one who wrote small poems in a notebook I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out dictionary on my bookshelf. We were opposite in almost every way, and that was, I think, why we worked. That summer, though, something had shifted between us, and I could not put my finger on what it was. He was over at my house almost every day, sometimes twice a day, and where before he had always been restless, always wanting to go somewhere or do something, now he seemed content to just sit on the floor of my bedroom and read comics and talk. He asked me strange questions sometimes. Questions about how I felt about certain things. Questions about whether I ever thought about the future, about who I wanted to be. I did not know what to make of it, and so I answered the way 14-year-old boys answer, with shrugs and half-sentences and jokes to change the subject. But I noticed. I noticed everything about Julian that summer, more than I had ever noticed about anyone, and I did not know what that meant either. The stockings, meanwhile, stayed under my pillow for 3 whole days before I put them on again. And the second time was different. The second time, I did not laugh. The second time, I stood in front of the mirror and I looked at myself for a long, long time, and I thought about what it would be like to have more. Just a little more. A skirt, maybe, or one of the soft blouses I had seen in the department store window downtown. Nothing serious. Nothing anyone would ever have to know about. Just for me, just for the quiet hour between when my mother left for the library and when Julian came knocking at the back door. It was a secret, and secrets, I told myself, were fine as long as they stayed secret. That was my first mistake, and it was a small one, but small mistakes have a way of becoming large ones when you are 14, and you do not yet understand that the world sees everything, eventually. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was the day my mother worked late, cataloging returned books until 3, and so I had until 3 to do whatever I wanted, and what I wanted that Tuesday was to try on the pale blue sundress I had discovered in the very back of the guest room closet. It had belonged, I think, to my aunt, who had left it there years ago after a visit and never come back for it, and it had hung there in the darkness of that closet like a promise waiting to be kept. I had found it by accident a week earlier, when I had been looking for a board game, and I had not been able to stop thinking about it since. So on that Tuesday, with the house empty and the sun high, and my mother safely across town at the library, I took the dress from the closet and I carried it to my room and I laid it out on my bed like an offering. I put on the stockings first. Then I unbuttoned the dress with fingers that were shaking, though I could not have said whether it was from excitement or fear or both. I stepped into it. I pulled it up. I could not do the zipper in the back, no matter how I contorted my arms, but I held it closed with one hand and I turned to face the mirror, and what I saw made me forget to breathe. Because for the first time in my life, I looked at my reflection, and I did not see a scrawny 14-year-old boy with elbows and knees, and a face that never quite fit together. I saw someone else. Someone softer. Someone with pale bare shoulders and a slender neck and legs that shimmered faintly in the afternoon light. And this someone was smiling, a small, uncertain, wondering smile, and I recognized the smile as my own, and I did not recognize it at all, and both of those things were true at the same time. I stood there for what must have been 10 minutes, just staring. I turned. I tried to see myself from the side. I lifted my hair with one hand, imagining what it would look like if it were longer, if it were pinned up, if it were curled. I whispered a name to myself, a name I had never said out loud before, a name that had lived somewhere in the back of my mind for as long as I could remember, and hearing it in my own voice, in that quiet room, was like hearing a door click open somewhere deep inside me. And that is when I heard the back door of the house open downstairs, and I heard footsteps in the kitchen, and I heard Julian call my name. I froze. I have never, before or since, felt terror like that. It was a cold, physical thing, and it started in my stomach and went outward in waves. My mouth went dry. My legs would not move. I heard him call again, closer now, at the bottom of the stairs, and I heard him start to come up. I finally managed to unfreeze myself, and I lunged for the bedroom door, but the dress was around my legs and the stockings were slippery on the wooden floor, and I stumbled, and by the time I reached the door and put my hand on it to close it, he was already there at the top of the stairs, looking directly at me. Everything stopped. He stood in the doorway, or rather at the top of the stairs looking through the doorway, because I had not managed to close the door in time, and I stood there in the middle of my bedroom in a pale blue sundress that I could not zip up and stockings that were sliding down my thigh, and neither of us moved for what felt like 100 years. I could hear the clock on my dresser ticking. I could hear a bird outside the window. I could hear my own heart hammering in my ears so loudly that I thought I might actually pass out, and part of me hoped I would, because passing out seemed easier than whatever was about to happen. Julian's face went through about 6 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds. First there was surprise, a wide-eyed, mouth-open surprise, and then there was confusion, and then there was something like recognition, though what he recognized I could not have said. And then, and this is the part one remember most clearly, then his face went very still and very calm, and he stepped into the room, and he closed the bedroom door quietly behind him. I still had not moved. I still had not said a word. I was waiting for the laughter. I was waiting for the disgust. I was waiting for him to turn and run down the stairs and out of the house and out of my life forever, because that was what I deserved. That was the only possible ending to this scene that I could imagine, and I was already preparing myself for it, already trying to figure out how I would live the rest of my life without my best friend, when Julian did the thing that changed everything. He sat down. He walked over to my desk chair and he sat down and he put his hands on his knees and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, an expression that was serious and gentle and just a little bit sad, and he said, in a very quiet voice, "How long?" I did not understand the question at first. I stared at him. I opened my mouth. No sound came out. He tried again. "How long have you been doing this?" And something about the way he said it, the softness of it, the lack of any mockery or anger or fear in his voice, made me sit down too, right there on the floor in the middle of my room, in a dress I could not zip up and stockings that were sliding down my thighs, and I started to cry. I cried the way you cry when you have been holding something in for years, without knowing you were holding it in. I cried until my shoulders shook and my nose ran, and I could not see for the tears. And Julian did not laugh, and he did not leave, and he did not even look uncomfortable. He just sat there in my desk chair, waiting, watching me with those calm, sad, gentle eyes, and when I finally caught my breath enough to speak, I told him everything. I told him about the stockings and about how I had found them in the laundry, and about how I had put them back the first time, and how I had not been able to put them back the second time. I told him about the sundress in the guest room closet, and about the department store window, and about the name I had whispered to myself in the mirror 10 minutes before he had walked in. I told him things I had not even told myself, things that came pouring out of me the way water pours out of a broken pipe, unstoppable and undignified and desperately needed. And when I was done, when I had run out of words and I sat there on the floor with my face in my hands, waiting for the world to end, Julian said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. He said, "I already knew." I looked up. My face must have been a mess. His face was calm. "You knew?" I whispered. He nodded. "Not about the dress," he said. "Not exactly. But I knew there was something. I have known for a while." I did not know what to say to that. I did not know what he meant. I did not know whether to be relieved or terrified. Julian leaned forward in the chair. His hands were still on his knees. His curly dark hair had fallen into his eyes, and he did not push it back this time. He said, "Elliot, listen to me. It is okay. Do you understand? It is okay." And I did not understand, not really, not yet, but I nodded because he was my best friend and because he was still there, and because those were the only two facts I could hold on to in that moment. He stood up. He came over to where I was sitting on the floor. He knelt down beside me. He looked at the dress and at the stockings and at my tear-streaked face, and he said, very gently, "Do you want help with the zipper?" I laughed. I could not help it. It was such an absurd question, so wildly outside of anything I had expected him to say, that a laugh burst out of me before I could stop it, and once it started, I could not stop, and Julian started laughing too, and the two of us sat there on the floor of my bedroom laughing until we could not breathe, until the terror had shaken itself out of me and left behind something else, something new, something warm and small and fragile. And when we had finally caught our breath, I stood up and I turned my back to him, and I said, "Yes, please." And he zipped up the dress. And then he stepped back. And he looked at me, really looked at me, the way an artist looks at a painting or a friend looks at a friend they have not seen in a long time, and he said, softly, "You look nice." I could not speak. He said it again. "You do. You look really nice, Elliot." I turned to the mirror. He stood behind me. Our eyes met in the glass, and I saw that he was smiling a small, real smile, and I saw that I was smiling too, and I saw the pale blue dress and the shimmering stockings and the boy who was maybe not entirely a boy, and I did not know what any of it meant, but for the first time all summer, I was not afraid. That was the beginning. I want to be clear about that because everything that came after was built on that afternoon, on that moment in the mirror, on the way Julian had looked at me and said, "You look nice," as if it were the simplest, most obvious thing in the world. But it was also just a beginning, and beginnings, as I would come to learn, are the easy part. What came next was harder and stranger and more wonderful than I could have imagined. And it started the moment we heard the front door open downstairs, and my mother's voice called up the stairs, and I realized that she was home, 3 hours early, and that I was still in the dress. Julian and I looked at each other, and for the second time in less than an hour, I felt that cold terror rising up in my stomach. But this time, Julian was there, and he did not panic. He said very quickly, "Take off the dress. I will go downstairs and stall her. Come down when you are ready. Just be normal." And then he was gone, out the bedroom door and down the stairs, and I could hear him calling out to my mother in his usual cheerful voice, telling her hello, asking if she needed help carrying anything, and I stood there in the middle of my room, and I began, with shaking hands, to take off the dress. I hung it carefully on the back of my chair. I peeled off the stockings and folded them, and put them in the drawer of my bedside table, under a pile of old socks. I put on jeans and a t-shirt. I splashed water on my face at the little sink in my room. I checked the mirror to make sure my eyes were not too red. And then I went downstairs, and I found my mother in the kitchen unpacking a bag of groceries, and Julian sitting at the kitchen table pretending to read a magazine, and my mother turned and smiled at me and said, "There you are, sweetheart. I got out early. Are you boys hungry?" I smiled back at her, and I said we were, and I helped her put away the groceries, and Julian and I exchanged one quick glance across the kitchen, and that was that. The secret was still a secret, or so I thought. What I did not know then, and what I would not know for another 2 weeks, was that my mother had known for even longer than Julian had. And what I really did not know, what I could not possibly have known, was that she and Julian had, in their own quiet ways, been waiting. Waiting for me to be ready. Waiting for me to trust them. Waiting for the moment when they could stop pretending they had not noticed and start helping me instead. It took me 2 weeks to piece it together. The first clue came the very next morning. I got up, and I came down for breakfast, and there on the kitchen counter, folded neatly, was a soft cotton nightgown I had never seen before. Pale yellow, with tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem. My mother was at the counter, pouring coffee, and she did not turn around when I came in. She just said, in her ordinary morning voice, "I found that in the linen closet. It is too small for me now. I thought maybe you might have a use for it." I stood in the doorway of the kitchen. I could not speak. I could not move. She turned then, slowly, and she looked at me, and her eyes were kind, and they were also just a little bit wet, and she said, "Sweetheart, I am your mother. I have done your laundry for 14 years. I notice things. I opened my mouth. I closed it. I opened it again. I finally managed to say, in a very small voice, 'Mom.' And she came over to me, and she put her arms around me, and she held me the way she had held me when I was small, when I had scraped my knee or lost a game or come home from school with a story about being teased, and she said into my hair, 'I love you. Do you hear me? Whatever this is, whatever you are figuring out, I love you. We are going to figure it out together.' Okay." I nodded into her shoulder. I could not speak. I was crying again for the second time in 2 days, and I had not cried in years before that summer, and now it seemed like I could not stop, but this crying was different. This was not the terrified, ashamed crying of the day before. This was something else. This was the crying of relief, of being seen, of finally being able to put down a weight I had not even known I was carrying. My mother rocked me gently and she rubbed my back, and eventually the crying slowed and I stepped back and I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and I looked at her and she looked at me and she smiled. She said, "The nightgown. Do you want it?" I nodded. She said, "Then it is yours. And listen, I want you to know something. This is a safe house. This has always been a safe house. Your father, God rest him, would have said the same thing. Whoever you are becoming, this is where you get to figure it out. Not out there. Here. With me. Okay. I nodded again. And then, because I was 14 and words were hard, I said the only thing I could think of, which was, "Thank you, Mom." She kissed the top of my head. She went back to her coffee. And that was how my mother told me that she knew. That was the first clue. The second clue came 3 days later, when I came home from a walk with Julian to find a small pile of things on my bed. A pair of soft leggings. A cardigan, cream-colored, folded neatly. A hairbrush with a wooden handle. And on top of the pile, a folded note in my mother's handwriting that just said, "For whenever you want them. Love, Mom." I stood there, and I looked at that pile for a long time, and then I sat down on the edge of the bed, and I picked up the cardigan, and I held it against my face, and it smelled like the soap my mother used, and I thought about how in a single week my entire world had turned inside out, and how the strangest part of it was that everything was somehow gentler now, softer, easier to breathe in, as if a window had been opened in a room I had not known was stuffy. That night at dinner, my mother did not mention the pile of clothes on my bed. She talked about the library, and about a book she was reading, and about whether we should paint the front porch that summer, and I ate my dinner and I answered her questions, and I felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, that the two of us were on the same team. That there was no wall between us. That I did not have to hide. The third clue came a week after that, and this one was the one that told me my mother and Julian had been talking. It was a Saturday morning. Julian had come over early, and the two of us were in the backyard, throwing a tennis ball for our old dog, a scruffy little terrier named Biscuit who had been in the family since I was 6. My mother came out onto the back porch with 2 glasses of lemonade, and she set them down on the little wrought iron table, and she said, casually, as if she were commenting on the weather, "Julian, sweetheart, I was wondering, your aunt is out of town this weekend, is she not?" Julian looked up. He nodded. My mother said, "Would you like to stay over tonight? I was thinking of ordering pizza and putting on a movie. Elliot could use the company." Julian looked at me. I looked at him. My mother was pouring the lemonade, not looking at either of us. Julian said, "Yeah, that sounds great. I would like that." My mother nodded, still not looking up. She said, "Wonderful. And Elliot?" I looked at her. She was smiling now, a small, private smile that I did not entirely understand. She said, "Why do not you show Julian, when he comes over, what is in your closet? I think he might like to see." And then she went back into the house, and Julian and I were left in the backyard with our 2 glasses of lemonade and our old dog, and I felt my face go hot and my heart start to hammer, and I realized in that moment, all at once, that my mother and Julian had somehow, without my knowing, communicated. That she knew he knew. That he knew she knew. That the 3 of us were in this together, and had been in it together for longer than I had understood, and that the ground under my feet had shifted again, and I was going to have to catch up. Julian was watching me carefully. He said in a low voice, "You okay?" I said, "You have been talking to my mom." He hesitated. Then he nodded. He said, "A little. Not much. She came over to my aunt's house a few days ago, and she asked me some questions. About how I was doing. About how we were doing. And then she said that she thought you might be going through something, and she wanted me to know that if I was ever confused about anything, I could ask her. And I told her." I said, "You told her what?" He said, "I told her that I already knew. That I had seen you. That I did not think it was a bad thing."
And she said
she was glad. She said she had been hoping you had someone. I sat down on the grass. Biscuit came over and put his head in my lap. I scratched his ears. I said, "Julian." He said, "Yeah?" I said, "What is happening?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very slowly, "I think what is happening is that you have people who love you and they are trying to help you, and they are trying to do it in a way that does not scare you. That is what I think is happening." I looked at him. He was sitting on the grass a few feet away, his knees drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped around them, his curly dark hair falling into his eyes, and he was looking at me with that same calm, gentle expression he had worn in my bedroom 2 weeks earlier. And I understood, in that moment, that my best friend was a better person than I had ever realized. That my mother was, too. That I had spent so many years thinking of myself as alone with my secret, and it turned out I had never been alone. It had all been happening in plain sight. The whole time. I said, "Julian." He said, "Yeah?" I said, "Do you want to come inside?" He smiled. He nodded. And the two of us stood up and we went inside, and I took him up to my bedroom, and I showed him the pile of clothes my mother had left on my bed. He looked at them for a long time. He picked up the cardigan. He held it up, considering. He said, "This is nice. This is really nice. Your mom has good taste." I laughed. It was such a Julian thing to say. He put the cardigan back down. He looked at me. He said, "Do you want to put it on?" And I did. I put it on. I put on the leggings. I put on the cardigan. I sat down at my desk and I brushed my hair slowly with the wooden hairbrush, and Julian sat on my bed and watched me, and neither of us spoke, and it was one of the quietest, most peaceful moments I had ever known. When I was done, I stood up and I turned to face him and I said, "Well?" And he looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Elliot." I said, "Yeah?" He said, "Is that still your name?" I froze. I had not been expecting the question. I had not been expecting any question at all, and certainly not that one. I sat down on the edge of the bed next to him. I stared at the floor. I thought about the name I had whispered to myself in the mirror 3 weeks earlier, before any of this had happened, when I had still been alone with my secret. I thought about the way that name had felt in my mouth. I thought about whether I could say it out loud to another person for the first time. I said very quietly, "It is Ellie. When I am like this, it is Ellie." Julian nodded. He did not smile. He did not laugh. He said, in a voice as quiet as mine had been, "Ellie." "Okay, Ellie." And hearing him say it, hearing my own name said back to me by another human being for the first time, did something to me that I do not have good words for. It was like a key turning in a lock. It was like a light coming on in a room I had not known was dark. It was like coming home to a house I had never lived in, but somehow recognized. I looked up at him. He was smiling now, a small, warm smile. He said, "It suits you. I like it." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Ellie, do you want to keep the cardigan on when we go downstairs for dinner? Or do you want to change back?" And that was when I realized what he was really asking. He was asking whether I was ready for my mother to see me, not just the clothes on my bed, not just the idea of me, but the actual me, sitting at the kitchen table, wearing the cardigan and the leggings, being called Ellie by my best friend. It was a huge question. It was the biggest question anyone had ever asked me. And I sat there on the edge of the bed with Julia next to me, and I thought about it, really thought about it, and I realized that the answer was already there, waiting for me. I said, "I want to keep it on." He nodded. He stood up. He held out his hand. I took it. And the two of us walked out of my bedroom together, and we went down the stairs, and I could hear my mother in the kitchen, humming something under her breath as she cooked, and my heart was beating very fast, but not in the terrified way it had beaten 3 weeks ago in the hallway. This was a different kind of fast. This was the fast of standing at the top of a hill, of being about to jump into cold water, of stepping onto a stage. This was the fast of being about to become someone. We stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Julian looked at me. He said, "Ready?" I said, "No." He said, "Ready anyway?" I said, "Yes." And we walked into the kitchen. My mother was at the stove, stirring something in a pot. She heard us come in and she started to turn, and I saw her face begin to shift into a smile. The ordinary smile she always gave us when we came in for dinner, and then she saw me, and the smile changed. It did not disappear. It got bigger, actually, but it also got softer, and her eyes filled with tears, and she put the wooden spoon down on the counter, and she pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, and then she took a breath, and she said, "Oh, sweetheart. Look at you." I did not know what to say. I stood there in the doorway of the kitchen in the leggings and the cardigan, with my hair brushed and my hands trembling at my sides, and I looked at my mother, and my mother looked at me. And she came across the kitchen in 3 long strides, and she put her arms around me, and she held me the way she had held me 2 weeks earlier in that same kitchen, and she said into my hair, You look beautiful. Do you hear me? You look absolutely beautiful. I said, into her shoulder, Mom. She said, Yes, sweetheart. I said, There is something I want to tell you. She said, Okay. I said, When I am like this. My name is Ellie. She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled back, just a little, so that she could look at my face, and she said, with a smile so tender and so certain that it made my chest ache, Ellie. It is nice to meet you, Ellie. I am your mother. And that, more than anything else, more than the dress in the guest room closet, more than the moment Julian had zipped me up in my bedroom, more than the nightgown on the counter or the pile of clothes on the bed, more than any of it, that was the moment I understood that my life had changed forever and that the change was good. Dinner that night was ordinary in the way that only extraordinary evenings can be ordinary. My mother served pasta and salad and garlic bread. Julian talked about a comic book he had just finished. My mother asked him about his aunt. I ate, and I laughed, and I passed the salt, and I felt the soft cotton of the cardigan against my arms, and I felt the leggings against my legs, and every so often my mother or Julian would call me Ellie, casually, in the middle of a sentence, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and each time they did it, something inside me settled a little more, like a bird finding its nest, like a stone finding its place in a wall. When dinner was over, I helped my mother clear the table, and Julian went into the living room to set up the movie. My mother handed me the plates, and I loaded them into the dishwasher, and she watched me for a moment, and then she said, quietly, Ellie. I looked up. She said, I want you to know something. I said, Okay. She said, This does not have to be the whole story. Do you understand? This can be one part of you. Or it can be more. Or it can change over time. There is no rush. There is no pressure. You do not have to know what any of this means yet. You just have to be honest with yourself, and with me, and with Julian. That is all. Okay. I nodded. She said, And if you ever want to talk about it, about any of it, I am here. And if you never want to talk about it, that is okay too. And if you want me to help you with things, with clothes, with hair, with anything, I am here for that as well. All you have to do is ask. I closed the dishwasher. I dried my hands on a dish towel. I looked at my mother, at the small lines around her eyes, at the gray at her temples, at the kind and steady woman who had raised me alone for 5 years, and I understood, all at once, how lucky I was. I said, Mom. She said, Yes? I said, Will you help me with my hair sometime? She smiled. Her eyes filled with tears again, but she was still smiling, and she said, I would love that, Ellie. I would love that more than anything. And that was the summer everything changed. I could tell you about the movie we watched that night, about how Julian sat on one side of me on the couch and my mother sat on the other, about how at some point I fell asleep with my head on Julian's shoulder and my feet in my mother's lap, and about how when I woke up in the morning I was tucked into my own bed in my pale yellow nightgown, and Julian was asleep on the pull-out couch in the living room, and my mother was already up making coffee, and it was just an ordinary Sunday morning. Except that I was Ellie now, at least sometimes, and everyone in the house knew it, and nothing bad had happened, and no one had been hurt, and the world had not ended. I could tell you about how, over the next few weeks, my mother took me into the small back office of the house, which she called the sewing room, and she showed me things. She showed me how to sit differently. She showed me how to walk in a way that felt more natural to me. She showed me how to brush my hair so that it would grow and soft, and she brought home a small tube of a very pale, natural tinted lip balm and showed me how to use just a little, just enough to make my mouth look a bit softer. She never pushed. She never insisted. She always asked before she showed me anything. Do you want to try this? Do you want me to teach you this? Would you like to see how this works? And every time I said yes, and every time she taught me, and every time I felt a little more like the person I had glimpsed in the mirror the day I had put on the sundress. I could tell you about how Julian started calling me Ellie whenever we were alone together, or whenever we were with my mother, and Elliot whenever we were out in the world with other people, and how the two of us developed a small, silent language of glances and code words to switch between the two, and how it never once felt awkward, and how he never once slipped up, and how he never once made me feel like I was asking too much of him. I could tell you about the day I came downstairs for the first time in a real skirt, a soft dark green one that my mother had brought home from a thrift store, and about how she stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched me come down, and about how she took a photograph of me without asking, and how she framed it and put it in a small silver frame that she kept in the sewing room, hidden from anyone else, but there whenever she or I wanted to see it. I could tell you about the afternoon Julian brought over a small bag of things he had bought at the drugstore with his own allowance money, and how in the bag were a pack of hair clips and a small bottle of nail polish, a very pale, quiet pink, and how he had said, blushing a little for the first time all summer, that he had thought maybe I would like them, and how I had, in fact, liked them very much, and how the three of us, my mother and Julian and I, had spent a whole Saturday afternoon in the kitchen with the pale pink polish, and how Julian had insisted on painting his own thumb, just his thumb, as a joke, and how my mother had laughed so hard she had cried, and how none of us had felt strange about any of it, not for a single second. But what I really want to tell you, what I want you to understand, is what it was like on the inside during those weeks. Because what happened on the outside, the clothes and the hair, and the name, and the pale pink polish, all of that was only the visible part. What happened on the inside was so much bigger. On the inside, I was learning what it felt like to not be afraid. I was learning what it felt like to walk down a hallway without holding my breath. I was learning what it felt like to look at myself in a mirror and to see myself, actually see myself, not the boy I had thought I was supposed to be and not the girl I sometimes wanted to be, but something more complicated than either, something that was both and neither and mine. I was learning that identity is not a single fixed point, but a country, with mountains and rivers and valleys and small quiet towns, and that you get to travel through it your whole life, and that no one else can tell you where the borders are. I was learning that the two people in my life who mattered most had been holding a space open for me, quietly, patiently, without my knowing it, and that when I had finally stepped into that space, they had been ready. I was learning what love looked like when it did not come with conditions. My mother had said, that first morning in the kitchen, that our house was a safe house. I had not fully understood what she meant at the time. I understood it now. A safe house, I realized, was not a house where nothing hard ever happened. A safe house was a house where the hard things could happen, and you would still be loved on the other side. A safe house was a house where you could take off one version of yourself and put on another, and no one would ask you to justify it. No one would ask you to explain it. No one would ask you to promise anything. A safe house was a house where the walls held you and did not press in on you, where the doors closed to keep the world out and opened to let you back in whenever you wanted, where the floors did not creak in judgment, but only in the ordinary way that old houses creak, from age and from weight and from the passing of many feet over many years. Our house on Maple Row was a safe house. That was what my mother had built without my ever knowing she was building it, and now that I had walked into it, I understood that I had always lived there, and that I always would. There was one more moment that summer that I want to tell you about, one more moment that stands out even against all the others, and it happened in early August, about 6 weeks after Julian had first walked into my bedroom and found me in the pale blue sundress. It was a Wednesday evening. The heat of the day had broken, and my mother had suggested that the three of us take a walk down to the small pond at the edge of town, the one with the little wooden dock where kids used to fish in the summer. She had packed a small picnic in a basket, sandwiches and cut fruit and a thermos of iced tea, and she had said, casually as she was packing, "Ellie, do you want to wear the green skirt? It is a nice night for it. It should be dark by the time we come home." I had looked at her. I had looked at Julian. Julian had shrugged in his easy way and said, "I like the green skirt." And I had thought about it. I had thought about walking out of the house, out into the street, out into the world, in the green skirt. I had thought about being seen by neighbors, by strangers, by anyone who might happen to be out on their porch or driving down the road. I had thought about it, and I had felt my old fear rise up, the cold thing in my stomach, the tightening in my throat, and then, and this was new, I had felt something else rise up too. Something quieter, but stronger. Something that said, why not? Something that said, they will see what they see, and it will not change what is true. Something that said, you are ready. I had said, okay, I will wear the skirt. My mother had smiled. Julian had smiled. And 20 minutes later, The three of us were walking down Maple Row in the golden light of the early evening, my mother on one side of me and Julian on the other, and I was wearing the dark green skirt and the cream cardigan, and my hair was brushed back with two small clips, and my nails were painted a pale, quiet pink, and I was walking down the street where I had lived my whole life, and I was not hiding, and I was not afraid, and I was Ellie. We passed old Mrs. Hensley on her porch, who waved to my mother, and I saw her look at me, and I saw her look again, and I saw her face go through the same kind of small progression that Julian's had gone through 6 weeks earlier. Surprise and confusion, and then a slow, warm understanding, and then she waved to me, too, and she called out, "Nice evening, Diane. Nice evening, kids." And my mother waved back and called out that it was, and we kept walking, and I did not fall apart, and the sky did not fall on my head, and I looked at my mother, and my mother squeezed my hand, and Julian bumped his shoulder against mine, and I understood, all at once, that the world had made room for me. Or maybe not the whole world. Maybe just this street, just this small town, just this one warm August evening. But this street was where I lived. This town was where I was growing up. This evening was mine, and it was enough. We walked to the pond. We sat on the little wooden dock. My mother poured iced tea into 3 plastic cups. Julian talked about the school year that was coming, about how we were going to be starting high school in a few weeks, and about how he thought it was going to be fine, and about how if anyone gave either of us trouble, he would deal with it. My mother listened and she smiled, and she reached over at one point and touched my hair, just briefly, just a small, gentle touch, the way a mother touches a daughter, and I did not flinch, and I did not pull away, and something inside me, some very old, very tired part of me, finally let out a long breath and lay down to rest. That was the summer. That was how it happened. That was how I went from being a scared 14-year-old boy standing in a hallway with a pair of stockings in his hands, to being a 14-year-old somebody sitting on a wooden dock in the evening light with my 2 favorite people in the world, wearing a skirt, drinking iced tea, and thinking, for the first time in as long as I could remember, that I was going to be okay. I want to tell you what happened after, because a lot of stories end here. A lot of stories, especially stories like this one, want to end at the golden moment, at the picnic on the dock, at the wave from Mrs. Hensley, at the mother's touch on the daughter's hair. But real life does not end at golden moments. Real life keeps going. And I think you deserve to know a little of what came next, because what came next is part of the story too, and because I promised at the beginning of this that I would tell it right. High school started 3 weeks after the picnic at the pond. I did not go to school as Ellie. Not that year, and not the year after, and not for a long time after that. That was my choice, and it was one my mother and Julian both respected. High school in our small town was not a safe house. High school was a place where I had to be careful, where I had to think about who I was with, and what I said, and how I stood, and whom I trusted. I went to school as Elliot. I wore boy clothes. I kept my hair short enough to look ordinary. I did my homework, and I ate lunch in the cafeteria, and I tried out for the school newspaper, and I made a few new friends, and I did not tell any of them about the pale blue sundress or the wooden dock or the name Ellie. That part of my life stayed at home. That part of my life stayed in the sewing room, in the small silver frame on my mother's shelf, in the pile of clothes that had grown, slowly over the years, into a small wardrobe of its own, kept in the back of my closet behind the boy clothes. That part of my life stayed with Julian, who never, in all the years of our friendship, told a single other person, and who never, in all the years of our friendship, made me feel that keeping the secret was a burden to him. But it was still there. It was always there. I would come home from school on a Friday afternoon, and I would drop my backpack in the hallway, and I would go upstairs, and I would change, and by the time my mother got home from the library, I would be Ellie sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework in a soft sweater and jeans that fit differently, and she would kiss the top of my head and ask me how school had been, and I would tell her, and the weight of the week would slide off my shoulders like a coat I had been wearing too long. On weekends, Julian would come over, and the 3 of us would cook dinner together, or watch a movie, or sit in the backyard and read, and I would be Ellie the whole time, and it would feel like breathing after being underwater. Over the years, as I got older, the space I could be Ellie in slowly grew. My mother took me on a trip when I was 16 to a city 3 hours away, and I went as Ellie the whole time, and no one looked at me twice, and I ate in restaurants and walked through museums and bought a small silver bracelet with my own saved-up money, and it was the best trip of my life. When I was 17, I told my grandmother, my father's mother, who had always been a kind and quiet presence in our lives, and she had cried a little and then told me she had suspected since I was small, since I had spent an entire summer at her house when I was 6 insisting on wearing her old kitchen apron everywhere I went, and she had hugged me and told me she was proud of me, and she had added me, in her own handwriting, to the small list of names in the front of her old Bible under the name I had chosen. When I was 18, on the day I graduated from high school, I walked across the stage as Elliot because that was still the name on my school records, and my mother and Julian and my grandmother sat in the audience and cheered, and afterward, in the parking lot behind the school, I changed clothes in the back of my mother's car, and we went out to dinner as a family, and I was Ellie, and no one who saw us that night would have guessed that the girl in the pale gray dress at the table by the window had been anyone else, ever in her life. I want to tell you what became of Julian because I know you are wondering. Julian and I stayed best friends all through high school and all through the years after, and we are best friends still. He went to college in the same city where I now live, and I went to college 3 hours away, and every weekend one of us would drive to the other, and we would sit up half the night talking, the way we had sat up half the night talking that first night on the pull-out couch in my mother's living room when I was 14 and had just become Ellie for the first time in front of another human being. He was the first person, other than my mother, to ever call me by my chosen name. He is still one of the people who has said it the most. He was, in his quiet, easy, curly-haired way, a hero. He never made a big deal of it. He never asked for credit. He never told me, in all the years of our friendship, that he thought he had done anything special. But he had. He had walked into my bedroom on a Tuesday afternoon when I was 14, and he had seen me at my most vulnerable and my most exposed, at the moment I was most afraid, and he had sat down in a chair, and he had asked me gently how long. Just that. How long? And he had listened to the answer. And he had zipped up the dress. And he had never, from that day to this, given me a single reason to regret that he had been the one to walk through that door. I want to tell you, most of all, what became of my mother. Because if there is a hero in this story, it is her. Julian gave me a friend. My mother gave me a life. She spent the rest of her life, right up until she passed away 3 years ago, being the safest house I ever knew. She helped me with clothes when I was 14, and she helped me with makeup when I was 15, and she helped me plan a summer of my own when I was 16, and she helped me pick a college when I was 17, and she stood next to me at my grandmother's funeral when I was 19, and she was the first person I called when I met the woman who would eventually become my wife, when I was 23, and she was the first person to hold my daughter when I was 29, and she was the first person to teach that little girl how to brush her hair with the same wooden hairbrush that had sat on my desk in a small bedroom on Maple Row on a Saturday morning a long, long time ago. She never, in all those years, made me feel like being Ellie was a problem to be managed. She made me feel like being Ellie was a gift to be tended. She made me feel like I had 2 names and both of them were mine, and I did not have to choose between them, and I did not have to explain them to anyone I did not want to explain them to, and I did not have to apologize for either of them, ever, to anyone. When she passed away, my mother left me a letter. She had written it years earlier, and she had tucked it into a small envelope in the back of her jewelry box, and she had told me, once, casually, that if anything ever happened to her, I should look there. I looked there. The letter was 2 pages long, and I do not want to share most of it because most of it is between me and her, but I want to share the last paragraph because I think it belongs in this story at the end of it where all the good things belong. She wrote, "My darling, whatever name you are going by when you read this, whatever version of yourself you have become, whatever the world has done to you, and whatever you have made of it, I want you to know that I have loved you every single day of your life. I loved the small boy who used to fall asleep on my chest. I loved the scared teenager who used to try on my stockings when he thought I was not looking. I loved the young woman who came down the stairs one summer evening in a green skirt with her hair brushed back. I loved the person who sat next to me on the porch through all the long years of my widowhood and made me laugh. I love the person you are now, whoever that is, and I will love the person you are becoming, whoever that turns out to be. You have never had to earn my love. You have never had to justify who you are. You have only ever had to come home to me, and I have always been here, and I always will be, in whatever way I can be, for as long as you need me. Your mother always. I keep that letter in a small wooden box in the back of my closet. The same closet in a different house, in a different city, in a different life, but the same closet if you understand what I mean. The box also contains a pair of pale, silvery stockings, which I never wear anymore because they are too old and too fragile, but which I cannot bear to throw away. It also contains a photograph in a small silver frame of a 14-year-old in a green skirt and cream cardigan, standing at the bottom of a wooden staircase, looking not quite at the camera, half smiling, half crying, on her way out into a summer evening. That is where I am going to end this. Not at the beginning of the story and not in the middle of the story, but here in a quiet room in a quiet house with a small wooden box on a shelf and a woman named Ellie writing down what happened to her a long time ago so that she does not forget and so that other people, if they need to, can read it. If you are reading this and you are 14 years old and you have just found a pair of stockings in your mother's laundry and you do not know what any of it means and you are afraid, I want you to know something. I want you to know that you are not alone. I want you to know that there might be, in your life, people who already know, who are just waiting for you to trust them, who are just waiting for the moment when they can stop pretending they have not noticed and start helping you instead. I want you to know that your best friend might turn out to be braver than you think. I want you to know that your mother might turn out to be wiser than you think. I want you to know that the door in the hallway, the one you are afraid to open, might have people on the other side of it who love you already, who have loved you all along, who are just waiting to see who you really are so that they can love that person too. I want you to know that a house can be a safe house. I want you to know that a name can be a home. I want you to know that a green skirt and a walk to a pond on a summer evening can be, in their own small way, a kind of miracle. I want you to know that the person you are becoming, whoever she is, whoever he is, whoever they are, is not a mistake. Not now. Not ever. You are the answer to a question your family has been quietly asking for years, without knowing they were asking it, and when you are ready to give them the answer, some of them, the good ones, the ones who count, will simply smile and say, "Oh, there you are. We have been waiting." And that is what happened to me. That is the whole story. That is what my best friend saw when he came up the stairs that Tuesday afternoon, and that is what my mother helped me become in the weeks and months and years that followed, and that is who I am now, sitting here in a quiet room, remembering. My name is Ellie. I was 14 when my best friend discovered my secret, and my own mother helped him take it further, further than I could ever have taken it alone, further than I had ever dared to imagine, all the way to the person I was always meant to be. That is the truth. That is the whole truth. And now, at last, it is a truth I can share.